Hearing things uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of VoTY Gimme Some Truth. Welcome all. In this podcast series, you'll be hearing why the truth matters, and you'll be hearing about matters of intrigue and the truth on those matters. And you'll be hearing that truth from the mouths of those who are subject to a kind of prescribed truth from the adult-led media. Instead, we'll be giving you a refreshing sense of the truth from the eyes of the youth, a kind of youth truth in a way. Today, truth is incredibly important to weather the storm of the information age as it enters an atmosphere saturated with conflict, whether that's ideological, coming from political, cultural, religious tensions across countries, within countries as well. And we'll be discussing that more in this episode, where we're talking about disinformation and misinformation. This means, naturally, this kind of tension between the ideologies, whether they're political, economic, cultural, religious, and also the information age, access to social media apps like Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, as well as the whole wide range of things you can get on the internet, means that dictatorships, anti-democratic countries, as well as democratic countries as well, can spread, in a way, if you like, propaganda, which can spread on this new information like wildfire. And this can breed loads of distrust and then add to the kind of sense of misinformation as well. And that can add to a growth in more extreme politics like we saw in Trumpism. Now, I've discussed here two key different areas, how this information age can be used by dictatorships and anti-democratic countries to spread what is called disinformation, but also how it can spread distrust and can spread misinformation, leading to more extreme politics such as Trumpism. Now, Zachary, if you could tell us quickly about the difference between disinformation and misinformation and how they're used.
So disinformation is the main difference is disinformation is purely intentional. Misinformation is not necessarily, it's a subgroup, it's a subcategory, a subgroup of misinformation. Misinformation is producing information that is false or inaccurate, and disinformation is when you do that on purposefully. And because of that, it's often used by governments or other authoritarian bodies to manipulate the facts, to benefit themselves or to benefit their peers or colleagues.
And both of them obviously have roles to play in the kind of political landscape at the moment, especially with disinformation. Could you tell us about what role disinformation has in terms of international relations?
As you've said, it's been used by both democratic and authoritarian governments around the world. So even in the US election we had a few months ago, Russian trolls, online trolls and bots were being used to target voters, particularly voters of colour in the US, to disenfranchise them from voting by either giving them misleading information or trying to intentionally provide them with links to websites that would claim that they had voted for something. In fact, in 2016 it was found that a Russian bot had set up a Facebook account that sent links to users across Facebook, particularly voters of colour, who were then told that they could vote by text. It didn't reach many people, but the state, I think it was Virginia in question, had to send out a warning about this and how you couldn't vote by phone. But it's also been used by these authoritarian governments, especially China at the moment. They've been producing disinformation with regards to the occurrences in Xinjiang with the horrific abuse of the Uyghur Muslim minority in the area now, who have been oppressed by the predominant Han Chinese and the authoritarian government there, as it's a dictatorship by the Chinese Communist Party, where they've been sent to horrific re-education camps, as the Chinese officials would call them. However, they are in incarceration of the Uyghur Muslims for not specifically obeying to the rules of Han Chinese. And because of that, they've had to completely lie. They've changed their story so many times. They said it's re-education. They've said that it's meant to make everything to save the Uyghurs, but it's absolutely not. We know from satellite imagery that it's complete lies, and it is disinformation, and that's how it's being used to prop its own image up across the world.
And we've also seen that within relation to COVID-19, with different countries, perhaps in relation to the vaccine, or even in terms of the relation of the virus. I'm thinking of America and China in this one, especially China, putting out disinformation to stop allegations that the virus came from China, and Trump called the coronavirus virus the Chinese virus, and then in the other direction it's being called the American virus. So how is China using disinformation in that sphere to protect itself against Donald Trump's claims?
Well, the problem for China is that it's an authoritarian government, and unlike a democratic government, it is, for the Chinese government, they are China. They are what represents China. They are inherently China. It's one China. But in the US, their officials are temporary. They are elected by the people, and it's very much interchangeable, which is why the Chinese government have had to push back, which is why there is less support for calling it the American virus. It didn't originate in America. The virus did originate in China. But it is true to say that Trump's attacks on it were xenophobic, particularly to the majority of Chinese Americans as well, or other Asian Americans. But in terms of what China's been doing, trying to call it the American virus, it's trying to prop up its own image because it has to stay strong. It cannot. It's unchangeable unless they want to lose their jobs and become a democracy. But there's no way, based on how well they are doing at the moment, given the pandemic that's striking the rest of the world, they will not want to let any of the status quo change about them.
Yeah, and also China, through the use of social media, has put out this story that the virus has actually originated from a military base in America. What effect does that information, that disinformation, have on people's perceptions?
Well, it is modern-day propaganda through, I think, Weibo and other services that the Chinese government has huge stakes in. And they've been using this just to... It's propaganda to manipulate the minds of the Chinese. And I think that its main aim is to show that it has resilience against America. There is always concern that if your population isn't on your side, if the Chinese think that the Communist Party are being overly harsh on them, if they're abusing them, and the horrific events in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, as they've most likely seen, the Chinese government needs to spin it in a way that makes it look good for them.
Yeah.
And to hold on to power, absolutely, as a dictator, Xi Jinping, the president of China, needs to hold on to power.
And then misinformation. We've seen how disinformation creates international conflicts. How is misinformation creating more domestic conflicts between ideologies?
Well, one of the vaccine misinformation is very common. Of course, it's the routine circulation of false information online. The way it's separated from specific disinformation is that often those people who are spreading the rumors think that it's true, so in their mind it is the truth, and so therefore it's not disinformation, but it is misinformation. It's misleading. So, for example, saying that the vaccines contain child livers, I think that's one that's been circulating, and it's not true. The vaccines have never been using the body parts of any child or human being, and because of that, and this, it's mostly to it's innocent users being either manipulated into pushing out this misinformation, which may have originated as disinformation from a source who wants to cause chaos and just ruin the efforts of healthcare workers who have been trying to stop this pandemic for over a year now. But it can also be from people who have misunderstood the science behind it, and they've been pushing it out, and it's caused real harms and effects. It's been shown that 30% of Americans are reluctant to take any COVID vaccine, and even though they've been pushed through trials and the government have insisted, yes, it is safe, it is not going to harm you, the vaccine, the misinformation going around is certainly not pushing that number any closer. It's drawing it down.
And then moving on to look at Trumpism as an example of this, is Trumpism this kind of mistrust of the media that comes with it? Is that more of a case of misinformation, perhaps spread by Trump supporters, or even perhaps a more disinformation spread by Trump himself as a very powerful individual when he was president of the United States? What is the cause of this mistrust?
It's very much I think it has, if I'm going to be honest, I think the rumours are spread through disinformation, but the whole concept of what Trumpists believe is misinformation. I think that the consistent feeling behind a lot of Trump supporters and voters from 2016 was that they didn't necessarily have a friend within them. They were right-wing, but they wanted to incorporate right-wing policies into benefit themselves. So parties like the Libertarian Party, they are far right, economically speaking, but they're quite liberal in policy. But they want, because they don't like taxes at all, but they do think that general liberal freedom should be observed. But and that was fine for them, but there was nothing that particularly encapsulated conservative movements as well. And I think that Trump's incorporation of that, it sort of spoke to people who felt that, number one, they were being cheated out of the system by governments, so they wanted to go on that economic right-wing sector to try and push themselves into a reduced government and keeping everything individuals and not having to pay much tax as they did before. But I think it's also incorporating into conservative policies. So conservative policies on immigration and stuff like that, because America is a changing country. By 2050 it's going to be majority not white, including Hispanic and Latino ethnic groups. And I think for that reason there's a sort of fear instilled in people that they need to protect themselves. And I think the misinformation that comes with that is what's been used to so these facts, these so-called facts on immigration and stuff, and is what is creating the Trump force, the fear that it generates.
We've seen how disinformation has actually helped exacerbate global tensions. Now, you just mentioned there that you think disinformation had a role to play in this Trumpism. Are they using this misleading information as a political tool, or is it more used on an individual basis?
I think that the January 6th riots at the Capitol were the biggest telltale of that. I mean, the best example of this is QAnon, the online the online group that believes that Democrats and most members of Congress are paedophiles who have been running sex trafficking rings. It's completely untrue, and it sounds insane if you don't believe it, that these well-paid, often millionaire public figures are conducting huge sex trafficking rings throughout their relative worlds, but but the disinformation that surrounds it is that it intrudes into people's lives. It intrudes into their Instagram, through Facebook. It sort of drags you in,
Yeah.
and as it does so, it's been used to bring people further and further in. It's a shifting of the Overton window, making more extreme ideas seem more tolerable.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's been coming on, and it's been used by these Trump supporters to justify their reason for doing such extreme actions. And I think the people behind it don't actually believe what they're saying, but they're using it to create events such as the January 6th riot, where the population sees it's no longer fit for purpose, and they riot and try to insurrect the government for their own political gain to keep Trump in office.
So I'm interested there. The root of the issue might come from disinformation, but then on a more individual level, where people are being exposed to more extreme views, as you just explained, does this create a paranoia of the media, mistrust of the media, which can then create a more steering towards conspiracy theories and then this more extreme political ideologies?
Yeah, well, the term fake news was barely used before the 2016 election. It was a term just thrown around to be like, oh, that's wrong, but it wasn't actually fully used until 2016, when Donald Trump came in, and conservatives then believed that anything that wasn't pure conservative news, or even if it was anything left of centre, it was completely fake news.
Yeah.
So CNN is a clear target for them. It's a left-wing news network, and it's characterised by Trump supporters as being highly being fake news, which most of its coverage is not. I think it's disputable, but even then, and I don't think that in the Bush years of George W. Bush, the former president, during 2000 to 2008 before Obama, I don't think anyone would have been throwing around terms like fake news about CNN at that time, and that sort of mistrust in mainstream media that flocks all the supporters over to Fox News. 40% of their audience identify as strong conservatives, and because of that, it's very important that they keep their full conservative view on all the time.
Okay. So how do we actually help to stop this? We don't want to impede on anyone's fundamental civil liberty of free speech. So how do we actually help to stop this great big problem of which creates tension in political ideologies and more conflict both internationally and at home? How do we actually stop it from becoming such a big problem?
Well, there's not much that can really be done, to be honest, particularly in countries like China and Russia, where the government owns their media. There isn't any way to prevent this information from coming up. It will be barraged at them through their government-owned state media. There isn't an alternative view. In democratic countries, it's much easier because in China and Russia, it will rely on people realizing for themselves and seeing through other forms of, whether that's democratic countries like the US forming cyber attacks onto Russia or China to try and push their own pro-democracy information, which would be an extreme event, but it could be done if it was perceived as a necessity. But I think the best way to do it, to try and solve that, is to try and have as many people as possible, particularly at the moment Alexei Navalny is being martyred in Russia for his efforts to try to combat Putin, and I think that it's really shown Putin's full colours, and Russia is becoming a much more tense place politically. But I think in democratic countries, it mostly relies on ensuring that people don't turn into these areas of misinformation and disinformation, looking out for what is not quite right. It's instilling trust in the mainstream, because when it's sort of like buying a new phone. If you're really happy with your phone, you're going to stick with it. If it's not working very well, you're going to get a new one. That is what's happening with democracy and with
Yeah.
we need to trust. So, like at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of Americans trusted people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, the chief strategist for the COVID response in the US. Now he's become a very political figure, and almost all Democrats love him, and barely any Republicans truly support him. He's now facing sacking from congressional Republicans, and so I think because of that, we really need to just make sure people are aware of what to look out for when it comes to disinformation. Look out for what the signs are, what is true, and making sure that people can still believe in our institutions even when they do wrong.
And that's really what VoTY is trying to do in this new podcast. VoTY Gimme Some Truth helps to do that, to help you analyse what is misinformation, what is disinformation, and to give you the truth as we see it, and then hopefully give you the tools you need to go out into the world and see what the truth is for you. So thank you for listening to this podcast, and you hope that you look into our other podcasts, VoTY Frontline, VoTY Broadcast, and also look out for the rest of these podcasts. Thank you for listening today. Goodbye.